from their region. Okay? Yes, men and women definitely persecuted, dragged off to prison together, hunted down together. And again, I find it interesting here too, God-fearing women of high standing, and the leading men of the city. Again, side by side, being persecuted. They worked together, all right, both secularly and spiritually. Acts 18:3. And because he was a tent maker, this is talking about Paul, as they were, talking about Priscilla and Aquila, he stayed and worked with them. Okay, so secular work, they both shared in the same knowledge base for earning money, they worked together. Romans 16:3, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Jesus Christ. Spiritual work, okay? They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful for them, okay? I dare say that we categorize as being heroic together too. Romans 16:6, greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. Romans 16:12, greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, those women who worked hard in the Lord. Greet my dear friend Persis, another woman who has worked very hard in the Lord. You see Paul in this passage of Romans 16, 8 women are named among the 26 people mentioned in this passage. And from the beginning to the end, Paul chooses with the most apt consideration the title and merit which belongs to each member of the household of God. Just like we talked about, one body, many parts. And he recognized the special work which a woman, and often only a woman, could do in the church. They gave together. Philippians 4:13, moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you only. Men and women had spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 12:11, all these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and he gives them to each one, just as he determines. And 1 Peter 4:10, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. And this was a bit of a source of contention for the early church with the variety in the spiritual gifts and the fact that women prophesied as well and a lot of other things too. But we all have a spiritual gift, men and women. Okay, they worship together. We looked at this passage extensively last week. I'm not going to go through it. 1 Corinthians 11:3-16, we talked about propriety in worship and prophesying and head coverings. But you see the picture of men and women worshiping together. They prophesied. Acts 21:9. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. 1 Corinthians 11:4-5. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's just as though her head were shaved. Okay, so we see males and females being pictured as having the gift of prophecy and needing to exercise it accordingly and respectfully. They were missionaries together. Priscilla and Aquila. We're going to look at them even more next week. But Acts 18:18, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. The next one is one I hadn't thought of before, but it's clearly there. They received reports together. Acts 14:27, on arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. Acts 15:4, when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Okay? Praise reports. Woohoo! Okay. I like this next one coming up. This is going to be good. All right. Both male and female worshipers of the Lord were raised to life. Anybody know the 2 that I'm going to mention?
Lazarus.
After Christ's ascension.
Oh.
That's Dorcas.
Dorcas is one. Dorcas is the female. I really like the example of the guys, and you guys can laugh at me when I get to this, but it should be a little levity here. Okay, yes, Dorcas, Tabitha, is raised to life. Acts 9:36-42. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas, who was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time, she became sick and died. Her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydia was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydia, they sent 2 men to him. Okay, 2 men saying, hey, we lost one of the females. Pretty significant. 2 men urging, please come at once. Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room, then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning towards the dead woman, he said, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Okay, so.
And was she a Gentile, if I remember correctly?
This is the entire passage that we have on Dorcas in terms of what we know about her. I'm not going to make that guess. But I would assume because it's translated being Dorcas, so it's very possible that, yeah. Okay. Eutychus. Okay, Eutychus falls off the third-story window and he's picked up dead. All right, now he falls asleep because Paul was talking on and on, so please, I'm so thankful. None of you guys are falling asleep at this point. Thank you. Okay, Eutychus. Acts 29 through 10. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. Please don't laugh. Okay, when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said, he's alive. Paul goes up, talks a little bit more. They take the guy home, and it's just really, really interesting. Okay. Both males and females encouraged by the Holy Spirit. Again, primary weapon of the early church. Holy Spirit, Acts 9:31. Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. It grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord. So we've got encouraged by the Holy Spirit. We also have believers encouraging one another. Acts 15:31. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message. This is basically Paul saying you don't have to don't eat food sacrificed to idols, refrain from unlawful marriage and blood, I believe. Acts 4:4 through 5, as they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Hebrews 10:24 through 25. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Very, very important. All right, and last but not least, they said goodbye together. Acts 21:5 through 6. But when our time was up, we left and continued on our way. All the disciples and their wives and children accompanied us out of the city, and there on the beach we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. Okay, so I think, if I'm not mistaken, let's see, are there any of these that we didn't cover? We covered that they worked together, they were in business, they praised and worshiped together, absolutely, that's what the piece did. Schooling, the education part, might not necessarily be documented in any of the ones that I brought up there, but I think it's fair to say that they were educating their young. Praying, very much, teaching, eating, clearly. Caring for family, yes, she dies. Two guys go and find out, they were aware of the sick that was going on. Witnessing, absolutely. The women were able to reach, or had access to at least the other half of humanity that the men didn't really have in that segregated society. Funerals, yeah. Births, not documented that I saw, but it's a good thought, and I would imagine it would be applicable. Outreach, absolutely. They were missionaries together. They spread the word. Lydia was the one who believed Paul's message, and then Paul gets thrown in prison, so he's only reaching pretty much the prisoners at that point, but when he gets out, he goes to Lydia's house, and there's all these believers at her house. So, yeah, she spread the word while Paul was in prison. Baptism, clearly, men and women baptized. Communion, yep. We do know from various frescoes that there are pictures of the females participating in communion. Praise together and martyrs. Oh, yes, clearly, martyrs, very much so. Okay, so let's go ahead and, so glad the Holy Spirit reminded me of this. Okay, what is one thing they never did together? Never stopped proclaiming Christ. Okay? They could not be silent. They never stopped proclaiming Christ. All right, let's look at our highlights, our handout section here. The body of what needs to be diversity? What?
Christ.
the body